Good evening, all. Thank you so much for joining us. Great. Good evening. Thanks for joining, everyone. We're just going to give a few minutes for people to log in, and then we'll jump into our program. And I'll just ask all panelists, if you could mute your lines while you're not speaking, that would be great. All right, good evening. My name is Joanne Kilgour, and I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio River Valley Institute. I'm pleased to welcome you all this evening to a Hydrogen and Carbon Capture Hub information session. This is a virtual conversation on the proposed Ohio River Valley Hydrogen and Carbon Capture Hub. A few housekeeping items before we begin. We'll be recording this session to share with individuals who are interested in the topic but unable to join us live. In addition, we have enabled live transcription for this event. So if you'd like to see closed captions, please feel free to select the live transcript option at the bottom of your screen. The briefing will begin with a panel discussion, and then we'll have an opportunity for questions and answers. So we really do want to hear from you and want to hear your questions and provide some responses. So there are two ways that you can do that. You can either send them through the chat or use the Q&A function to ask your questions. I'll keep track of them through the session, and then we'll have an opportunity to ask our panelists at the end. I'd now like to extend a special thanks to our co-hosts, Pittsburgh City Council member Erica Strasburger and State Representative Sarah Innamorato, as well as Allegheny County Council member Olivia Bennett. Before we introduce our panel this evening, I'd like to hand things over to Councilmember Strasburger and Representative Innamorato to share some opening remarks. Councilmember Strasburger.
Thank you, Joanne. Thank you to everyone for being here this evening. I want to thank you as the host of this, the Ohio River Valley Institute, and Representative Innamorato for, along with County Council member Liv Bennett for co-hosting this evening. I'm really looking forward to an hour and a half of pure learning, which I don't get the opportunity to do much anymore in a sort of focused and concentrated way, about an issue that I think will be, varying degrees of sort of new for different people on this panel or on this attending the panel tonight. When we're talking about, hydrogen and carbon capture, we're talking about potentially a very big investment that is coming into very targeted places around the United States from the federal government. And so I think it's incredibly important to go into something like this with eyes wide open. I have seen firsthand exactly what happens when a new industry emerges, especially an extractive industry emerges in a rural or a semi-rural part of Southwestern Pennsylvania. I've seen what happens to communities, to people, to workers, and to families. And I think it's imperative that everyone from neighbors and residents to the workers themselves to policymakers at all levels of government are fully informed and are armed with information before the industry comes and not after. And that we really understand how this will impact the economics of a region, especially the long-term implications, not just the short term, and the long-term job implications, what this means for local workers, whether it's going to be helpful for local workers or whether it's going to be more helpful for out-of-state workers coming in. I think those are questions I'm really interested in hearing about tonight. And of course, not to be sidelined at all, is the health of people in the region. And health is being determined by what we might call environmental issues, but truly it comes down to the health of people. Is this going to impact the air that they breathe and the water that they drink? And how is it going to change potentially a rural area? So I think those are all the questions that I am going to be listening for and asking this evening. And and really just excited to learn more about this topic. And I'm happy to pass it over to my co-host, Representative Sarah Innamorato.
Thank you, Councilmember Strausberger. And I just want to echo that same spirit of gratitude for all our panelists, for our hosts, but also everyone who's on here learning. I know I love to take this space to try to learn and understand new ideas, and I appreciate everyone going on that journey with us this evening. So as many of you know, Earth Day is tomorrow, and I'm sure, like many of you, I will be out in the communities helping getting our community gardens ready for the spring. We'll be picking up trash off the streets. We'll be cleaning up our parks. And I know that there are so many people who are out there who are figuring out what they can do as individuals to reduce their carbon footprint. And while these individual actions are a great way to connect with your neighbors or spread awareness about an issue, they alone cannot solve the climate crisis. And in order for us to have a significant impact on that, we need technological advancements and structural changes, along with creating strong public policies that reduce our reliance on fossil fuels in energy, manufacturing, and transportation sectors. We also need strong environmental protections that safeguard the public's health and well-being. And in Harrisburg, one of the options I'm hearing about quite frequently is about hydrogen and carbon capture. And I just don't know a lot about it. And I'm interested in finding out more, because I know that our federal government is also having this conversation and talking about earmarking billions of dollars for this type of investment that could end up being built in our own backyard. And, you know, I know that to address the climate crisis, we're going to need a portfolio of solutions. And every path we go down, there's going to be pros, there's going to be cons. That's a reality. And there's also no silver bullet. And as a lawmaker, I'm here to make decisions that are in the public's interests, and with all of my available knowledge and research, to decide what investments with our limited public resources are going to create the most amount of good for the most amount of people. Also, personally, I'm invested in creating family-sustaining jobs and strong local economies, cleaning up the environment that has already been harmed by extractive industries, and pouring into the people and communities that have been historically left behind in a just and equitable way. And so for me, this is a vital lens to wear when I'm assessing any proposed solution to the climate crisis and any public policy that comes to my awareness. So I look forward to listening and learning this evening about this new technology and its potential applications and impacts on our local environment and economy. And I'm so grateful for the folks who are here today. Please follow along, ask questions. We're all here to learn. And I'm going to kick it back over to Joanne to get us started. Thank you.
Thank you both so much for your leadership in the region and for co-hosting this important conversation. I'm now very pleased to introduce our panel. We're joined this evening by Sean O'Leary, a senior researcher with the Ohio River Valley Institute, Suzanne Mattei, energy policy analyst at the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, David Schlissel, director of resource planning analysis at the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, Rachel Fakhri, Natural Resources Defense Council lead for hydrogen and energy innovation, Stephen Feit, staff attorney with the Climate and Energy Program at the Center for International Environmental Law, and Shanti, associate professor at the University of Pittsburgh and author of the recent book, America's Energy Gamble. Thank you so much to our panelists. And Sean, I want to pass things on to you to give us an overview of this issue.
Sean, you're muted, I believe.
Okay, excuse me. While many of us have heard the phrase hydrogen hub, I've found that many people don't quite understand what it means, or at least that its meaning is so vague. So what I'm going to try to do in the next few minutes is describe exactly what the proposed hydrogen hub is and some of the implications that it might have. And we should begin by understanding that hydrogen is a very common element in nature that's used in many industrial processes, including oil refining, food processing, fertilizer production, and others. But hydrogen can also be used to store and release energy in the forms of electricity and heat. And when it's used for those purposes, it does so without releasing any greenhouse gases, which at a time when we need to decarbonize our transportation and industrial sectors makes it appealing as a potential energy resource. But there's a problem. Nearly all of the hydrogen we use today is derived from natural gas, which contains carbon that is released into the atmosphere when hydrogen is made through a process called steam methane reforming. And Ben, if you can go to that first slide. So when proponents of the hydrogen hub in the greater Ohio Valley refer to, quote, clean hydrogen, they're talking about supplementing steam methane reforming with a second process called carbon capture and sequestration that would capture the carbon currently emitted into the atmosphere during hydrogen production and then inject it into underground caverns for permanent storage. To enable this modified form of hydrogen production, they want to build hundreds of miles of pipelines throughout the region to carry the carbon that has been captured from the places where hydrogen is manufactured to injection sites. They also imagine using carbon capture technology and that same pipeline network to capture and store carbon from coal and gas power plants and factories of various sorts that currently emit greenhouse gases. In theory, doing this will clean up large parts of our energy and manufacturing sectors. And it's the network of pipelines and the equipment used to capture carbon that people are talking about when they use the term hydrogen hub. Ben, if you could go to the next slide. Thanks. There are as yet no specific plans for how extensive this hub would be or where the pipelines might go. But this diagram illustrates one concept and gives us an idea of the potential footprint. However, there are major problems with this vision, about which my fellow panelists will talk in greater detail. But in summary, the first is that carbon capture technologies, even under the most optimistic scenario, would fail to capture a significant share of the emissions and pollutions that we're trying to prevent. And second, the added infrastructure and processing that's required to make what is referred to generally as blue hydrogen is immensely expensive. Implementing carbon capture in the nation's coal and gas-fired power plants alone would increase the nation's electric bills by 25% or $1 trillion over a decade. Third, demand for hydrogen is likely to be much less than proponents often suggest. The reason we don't currently use hydrogen to do things like power cars and heat homes is that it's a far less efficient form of energy than alternative resources, especially electricity, with which we can generate, which can be generated by renewable resources at little or no incremental cost. Meanwhile, for industrial and transportation applications in which hydrogen has a legitimate use, there is another form of hydrogen called green hydrogen, which is made from water using renewable energy resources and which is likely to be cheaper than blue hydrogen by the end of this decade. Finally, development of the hydrogen and carbon capture hub would do almost nothing to stimulate job growth or prosperity, and it would shackle our region to fossil fuel industries that over the last decade have shown that they are structurally incapable of spurring sustained economic development. The Ohio River Valley Institute has reported on more viable clean energy transition and economic development strategies that have been shown to succeed in regions like ours and that would be less expensive and more effective solutions for both reducing greenhouse gas emissions and also for generating jobs and prosperity. So that's the intro. Thank you very much for allowing me to participate. And Joanne, I'll kick it back to you.
Thank you, Sean. I'm now pleased to pass things over to Suzanne Matei with IEFA. Oh,
Very
Suzanne,
happy to be
oh,
here.
great.
I just unmuted myself and am waiting for my little, there we go. So I'm going to be talking about blue hydrogen's commercial prospects. We think that they are weak. Next slide. All right, you've already heard about the different types of hydrogen. Green from water, H2O, you get oxygen and hydrogen. Blue from natural gas, methane molecules, about 70% of natural gas, you get a carbon molecule and 4 hydrogen molecules. It's only blue if the carbon capture meets the goal, and we don't think that it does. And then gray hydrogen, which is from natural gas with no carbon capture, that's what most hydrogen is made of now. Next slide. Okay, we don't think that time is on blue hydrogen's side. Next slide. It's going to take time for these things to get up and running. You know, they're not up and running now. So 2024, 2025 and beyond. And by that time, other technologies are, they're already chewing up the market, and they will chew it up even more. So solar and wind power, already 2/3 of the new power this year is solar and wind, 2/3. Peak demand, issue of intermittent supply, grid management and battery storage advances will likely eclipse blue hydrogen. Home and building heat, you know, possibly one of the worst places to use hydrogen. Thankfully, electrification is already advancing. It doesn't have the same technological and safety challenges that hydrogen has. Transportation, that as far as cars go, the boat has sailed. Electric vehicles are dominating the new car market, and they're also doing pretty well with small trucks. Next slide. Big trucks, heavy trucks, electric vehicles are still going to encroach, but to the extent that they do not, green hydrogen is going to compete with blue, and it's going to be more attractive for companies that want to have a good carbon footprint. Air travel, green will be competing with blue and with biofuels. And there are reasons to see biofuels as having more prospect for air travel than hydrogen, which I can get into. Ships, boy, they have not been doing much in the line of energy efficiency, and aggressive energy efficiency could cut their emissions by 2/3, greatly reducing demand. And again, blue hydrogen would be competing with green and biofuels. The main niche for hydrogen really is as industrial feedstock or for high temperature heat, and that exists now. It'll continue to exist, but again, green hydrogen is going to be competing with blue. Next slide. The National Renewable Energy Lab looked at the pie in the sky possibilities for hydrogen. Right now, it has about, it's covering about 9.6 million metric tons per year. They said, well, it could get up to as high as 106. But then they said, well, but let's look at the economics, let's look at the competition. What niche do they really have? And it brought it way, way down. Instead of being 11 times the existing usage, they said, well, maybe 2 to 4 times. And that's not including considerations of energy efficiency and other changes that we see as likely to chew that down much further. Next slide. So investors are wary. They don't like carbon capture. They've got a lot of concerns about it. And even the Global Carbon Capture Institute, which promotes carbon capture, has said blue hydrogen development has to have government capital grants. And it even advocates for governments to force banks to support carbon capture investments. That's not the sign of a winner. Next slide. We think that states should be considering these things as well and be equally wary. We think that states are going to be on the front line. Electeds are very much on the front line and need to be asking the hard questions. There's lots of promises, there's lots of estimates. What's the real world performance of this technology? And what are the real likelihoods for market and job impacts? Got to get very, very specific in light of competition. So I'm going to give it over to David Schlissel for a reality check on costs and performance. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I just have a couple of points I'd like to emphasize. Ben, if you could just go to slide 6 and keep it there rather than jumping around. There you are. Thank you. As Sean mentioned, the plan, or such as it is, for the Midwestern hub that's being discussed is to connect somewhere in the range of 56 to 150 power plants and factories. To give you a little perspective on how large a project that is, at present, there are only 27 carbon capture projects in the entire world. Only 7 of those capture the CO2 from the production of blue hydrogen, and only 7, not the same 7, store the captured CO2 underground. The rest of them, the projects, use it for what's called enhanced oil recovery, which means that the captured CO2 is injected underground in oil fields. It pushes out additional oil. That additional oil is then burned or used as a petrochemical feedstock, so it does not benefit the planet or its atmosphere or its people to any degree. So 3 key points. 1, very few carbon capture projects currently around the world. None of those that exist that we've found have achieved the 90 to 95% capture rate. That's how much of the CO2 they produce is captured. None of the existing projects capture the holy grail, so to speak, of the carbon capture industry, 90 to 95% capture. As you can see here, these are 4 examples of plants in the US and Canada. The 2 on the left are projects that produce hydrogen. The furthest left one is in Canada. The next one is in Texas. You can see neither of those projects captures 90 to 95% or more of the CO2 that they produce. The other 2 columns or sets of columns are coal-fired power plants, similar to the ones that are in the Midwest, where you folks live, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Ohio. And there you can see that the carbon capture facilities at these plants also do not capture the stated goal of 90 to 95% of the CO2 they produce. The third point I want to make is simply that carbon capture is very expensive. Currently, it about doubles the cost of operating a coal power plant And although the proponents of carbon capture claim that it will come down dramatically over time, there's no evidence that it has so far. And it's very speculative that it will. And I guess that's all I have for now. I think that complements what Suzanne said.
Thank you so much, David and Suzanne. Rachel, now to you to talk about some of the end uses of hydrogen and considerations related to that aspect of this conversation.
Great, thanks so much, Joanne, and the Ohio River Valley Institute and the co-hosts for holding this important session, and for all the audience for joining late on a Thursday. I think I'll be elaborating on a lot of what both Sean and Suzanne have already discussed, and we'll be focusing on the end uses. And we'll be probably taking a step back as to, you heard hydrogen is not suitable for many end uses, and I'll get into a little bit more why that is. And I would argue, I think from a holistic standpoint, that any hydrogen conversation really has to start with the end use conversation more than the production. Let's first think about where do we want to use it and where should it be used, and then talk about how do we produce it in a manner that is climate and community safe. So next slide, please, Ben. You heard this from Sean, will not harp on it, but hydrogen is not a new commodity. We already use it in our economy, largely in refineries to strip sulfur impurities from oil, as well as to produce fertilizer for agriculture. And it's largely produced from natural gas today. Next slide, please. Now, you may have heard this, that hydrogen is this wonderfully versatile tool. It's the Swiss Army knife of decarbonization, and we need to envision this broad role for it as we decarbonize our economy. And partly that is true. It can do a lot of the things that both oil and gas do today, and that it can be burned in lieu of gas to produce building heat. It could be burned in turbines to produce power or generate power. It could be used to produce iron and steel and other forms of industrial commodities. It could be burned to produce the very high temperatures that we need in our industries. On the oil side, it could replace oil to power cars and trucks, and it could also be used to power ships and aircraft. So this all sounds really great, except that, and next slide, please, harnessing that full versatility is not necessarily a good thing. And I think the closest synergy I can think of is oil and electricity. Oil can be theoretically burned to produce electricity, but we don't do it as much because it's really inefficient, it's really dirty, and there are better alternatives. And there's some synergies between that example and hydrogen. Yes, it could be used to do all these things, but is it really the best alternative? And don't we have much better ones? And really the crux here is that hydrogen incurs a very high energy penalty. It's a very inefficient resource. And here's what I mean. So this kind of the top pathway reflects a pathway where we're using hydrogen in our economy. Hydrogen cannot be found as a standalone gas. You have to produce it from something first. And in that process, you have energy losses because you have to produce it from something. So you start already with a 20–25% losses in your electricity if you're using that to produce hydrogen, or your gas if you're producing that to produce, or using that to produce the hydrogen. And then when you want to use that hydrogen, say in a car or in a boiler to produce heat, those equipment or appliances tend to be much less efficient than electric counterparts. So a hydrogen fuel cell car is about 40% less efficient than, say, a battery electric car. A hydrogen boiler, it can be up to 5 times less efficient than a heat pump. In comparison to a case where you're using your electricity directly, you don't have those losses on the production side. You can use your power directly. And then you use that in those appliances like battery EVs and heat pumps that are way more efficient than hydrogen. So on the whole, hydrogen is a really inefficient pathway when you have those alternatives. And next slide, please, Ben. And really the summary here is that this is an example that has been really put front and center that really exemplifies and illustrates the inefficiencies of hydrogen. But because of these conversions and losses on the production side, on the end use side, it's estimated that to heat a home with hydrogen would require up to 5 to 6 times as much renewable energy as to heat that home with a heat pump. And that puts enormous pressure on the system. Imagine investing indiscriminately in hydrogen in our buildings, our cars, our power plants, and putting all this pressure on the amount of energy we need for these really inefficient pathways. That would really complicate decarbonizing our economy and really increase the cost of the transition. I think we should do everything but complicate and increase the cost of the transition to a clean economy. Next slide, please. So where does hydrogen fit? Because we're not saying hydrogen doesn't have a role. It has a niche role in some really key applications, and we should be really focusing on those. And hydrogen can potentially play a key role in those sectors that don't have better alternatives. In particular, where the use of direct electricity may be infeasible. And this tends to be along 2 main categories. These are not the only ones, but that's, I think, generally well representative. But it's usually best used for those applications where you have to propel large equipment for long distances. Think an aircraft across the Pacific or a ship across the Atlantic. Using batteries may be very difficult because you need very large batteries, are very heavy, needs very long charging times. This is where hydrogen could really fit well because it's very energy dense fuel in some ways, so it could really propel equipment as far as you want. And for those industrial processes where you have to have some sort of a chemical reaction. And this is where it could fit really well to produce iron and steel, whereas electrification may not be able to do that as well. And I think that's it, Ben, but let's check. Next slide, please. Okay. So just to summarize, I think any hydrogen conversation has to start first by considering the end uses and by taking a very holistic view of how are we going to decarbonize our economy in the most efficient, affordable, beneficial way, and then evaluate where hydrogen fits in that story. And it will largely be in those niche sectors as opposed to a broader hydrogen economy. Back to you, Joanne. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, we'll hear from Stephen Feit. Stephen is with the Center for International Environmental Law and will be providing us with a context for how this conversation is taking shape across the country and in regions outside of the Ohio River Valley as well. Stephen?
Thanks so much, Joanne. We've talked about a lot of the trees, but I do want to zoom out and kind of look at the forest, right? If blue hydrogen and CCS are such a bad bet with such limited applications, why is so much money flowing towards them and why is there so much interest? And the answer is really, it's a two-headed hydra. Next slide, please. So carbon capture is the answer to the question, how do you use fossil fuels indefinitely while claiming to take climate action? In about I think this was 2018, but I forget the exact year, Shell, like the oil company, released a scenario that purported to be Paris compliant. It's not next slide, but click, please. What you can see is that in their scenario, all the way to 2100, they project quite a significant amount of fossil fuel usage, not that much less than in other scenarios, and not even all that much less than what we're using currently. Click again, please. And the way they do that is by assuming an enormous deployment of carbon capture and storage facilities, both point source carbon capture at fossil fuel facilities, but also BECCS, so bioenergy, which is purportedly carbon negative. So this is one head of the hydra. This is how fossil fuels stick around in an era of climate action. The other one is what happens with the CO2. Next slide, please. almost all of the carbon dioxide that gets recovered through CCS is used for enhanced oil recovery, right? This is a way to get more oil out of wells that have already mostly been tapped. About 10 years ago, a group of industry participants and related groups put together the National Enhanced Oil Recovery Initiative, which is now the Carbon Capture Coalition, to push for policies to support carbon capture to provide a source of CO2 for EOR. Because as they point out, the main barrier to taking advantage of CO2 EOR's potential is an insufficient supply of affordable CO2. So actually, next slide, please. And that is why, click twice again, please. More than 80% of all existing carbon capture capacity is for enhanced oil recovery, not storage, and why more than 80% of the credits for carbon capture have gone to oil and gas companies. That in many ways, this is really about opening up a new front in oil production. Hydrogen comes in as the as a way to square some of the inconsistencies with the CCS paradigm. Carbon capture doesn't eliminate all emissions. It requires additional upstream fossil fuel production and associated emissions. But hydrogen, as we've talked about, has no emissions at the point of use, and green hydrogen is a real solution, though its applications are limited. But when you're looking at a hydrogen molecule, there's no distinguishing whether it's green or blue once you've already got it. Next slide, please. And what we're seeing is that even green hydrogen proponents acknowledge that blue hydrogen, or that green hydrogen, is being exploited by the fossil fuel industry, with blue hydrogen being just the next bridge fuel, a claim that a huge build out of blue hydrogen will be necessary in order to get us from here to the green hydrogen future that we all need. Next slide, please. To do the build out at this kind of scale, and this is really just talking about carbon dioxide pipelines, you would need pipeline developments that's completely infeasible. Click, please. Princeton University did a model where they looked at how many pipelines you would need to sequester 15% of current US greenhouse gas emissions, and it would require infrastructure roughly the size of the current oil distribution infrastructure, a system that has taken about 100 years to build. When you map that out, next slide, you see that in just 30 years, we're talking about building out a massive network of pipelines running through, ranging from the East Coast all the way through to the mountains, and then also a Western system mostly focused on California. Even if you are not around one of the facilities that carbon capture would be applied to, this would affect you. And so on the one hand, this is entirely infeasible from a private perspective without enormous public subsidy. On the other hand, that is exactly what has been happening so far. The 45Q tax credit, the subsidies in the Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act are all inversions of the polluter pays principle, where they are providing financial incentive for companies to, to install and operate carbon capture. What we're seeing now is, and I apologize that I didn't get a chance to map this out, is a rush to build projects and lock this infrastructure in place. We see proposals for a $100 billion carbon storage hub off the coast, outside of Houston, a number of pipeline projects in the upper Midwest through the ethanol refinery belt, and a focus on California and the Ohio River Valley as the next tranche of CCS and hydrogen build out. Next slide, please. This is actually, next slide, this is hard to read. Thank you. This is a chart from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which just released its third working group report a few weeks ago. Click, please. It shows how over the next 10 years or so, CCS has a really, really limited possible contribution to emissions reductions and would do so at an extremely high cost. It's really clear that if CCS has any role to play, it is marginal at best. And the same can be said of blue hydrogen if it had, but anyway, the reason proponents are pushing for CCS as hard as they are is to lock these facilities into place and to overlay a parasitic infrastructure on the fossil fuel system that already exists to keep it in place and to claim to do so in the guise of climate action. I think I'm over time, so with that, I will end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Our next panelist is Shanti, who's a professor at the University of Pittsburgh and recent author of the book, America's Energy Gamble. Shanti?
Thank you so much. Ben, can you just put that one simple slide? Okay, so my perspective is as somebody living in Pennsylvania, where this newest shiny object is being presented to us. So I just want to remind ourselves about the work that has been going on in this region to diversify our economy. So I'm taking this slide from Reimagine Appalachia. As many of you know, this is a group of labor organizations, environmental organizations, civic organizations that came together to have a dialogue on how we can move our economy forward in a way that's sustainable and in a way that's equitable, that's good for workers, communities, and our health. It's very much centered on creating wealth locally. And based on this dialogue, there is a recognition that we have strategies for economic diversification, deployment of renewable energy and energy efficiency, including weatherization, which would create a tremendous number of jobs and at the same time cut our energy use and make it more affordable to many people. We can grow our clean energy manufacturing. We want to focus on regenerative agriculture, and we want to focus on conservation in the ecosystem. So we have a plan, it's in place. There is tremendous work being done on the ground by various groups, including Appalachia Voices, bringing in clean energy, Invest Appalachia, which is bringing in investment in the region, very much focused on this idea of creating wealth locally. And now I see after these presentations by our colleagues, I'm in a little bit of a panic attack here. Because I see what is proposed today. It has been pitched as one strategy to revitalize Appalachia, to build out this hydrogen hub and carbon capture. However, there is no linkage with what local communities have articulated that are our priorities in the region. And in terms of the promise on using hydrogen hub to revitalize Appalachia, it's contradictory because of what Suzanne and David have shown us, that this is going to cost, it's not going to be cost competitive. We have cost competitive solutions, solar, wind, demand response, and storage is already feasible for cutting emissions today, and at the same time generating the jobs that we need in this region. And I have a sense of déjà vu here, where we see a new shiny object being proposed to us, and with the promises of jobs and of addressing climate. I take the point that for a very narrow set of users, for example, hard to decarbonize industries, we would need hydrogen. But from the presentations, it's clear that it's very, very narrow and a small set of demands. So I hear again this idea that there's promises of jobs, but from a strategy that's economically not profitable. And I'm also hearing that this strategy requires significant subsidies to keep it going. And from an economic development perspective, it's completely not prudent. We have already thought through what strategies would be cost effective. And the idea of taking scarce taxpayer money towards subsidizing yet another shiny object makes very little sense. And again, a sense of deja vu, the pipeline build out is tremendously disconcerting because this region has seen the effects of a pipeline build out and there is significant opposition. And because of that opposition, we now hear about proposals to give primacy for pipeline build out, already stopping the potential opposition to these ideas. So all in all, my final thought is that if we think about the two pitch that, this is a strategy for revitalizing Appalachia, let's think about what is the strategy that has been identified as most cost effective. What is the strategy that would spread the job creation? And what is the strategy that has come about from the dialogue in our region? And that's my final thought. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. We're going to turn to some questions and answers now. And again, for anyone who's attending, if you do have questions, please feel free to pose them either in the question and answer box or in the chat, and I'll make sure to include those in our discussion. So the first question is with respect to transparency. And one of our attendees mentions that transparency is often discussed as one of the value commitments of the Department of Energy's program management. And yet it's been very hard for the public to have access to a lot of the spaces where these conversations have taken place. Stephen, I might start with you and just have you begin with addressing what we've seen so far in terms of transparency and how can we ensure that the public is taken seriously as we move forward with these kind of decisions?
For sure. I think what we've seen so far is a mixed bag that's getting better, but certainly isn't good enough. Certainly the Department of Energy has been conducting public hearing and soliciting input. I know there have also been really significant barriers to putting in that input, ranging from the amount of time that's offered to needing to be registered as a contractor with DOE to be eligible to provide that input, and a number of other obstacles. I don't have any special insight except that I think the unfortunate answer is to just keep putting pressure on the agency to make clear, make your voice heard, if not through the official channels, then in public and through the unofficial ones, and to continue demanding the transparency that they're obligated to provide. And then of course, some of this might involve legal action and Freedom of Information Act requests, but that gets at the very, that gets a bit more specific.
Thank you. Suzanne?
There's transparency at the federal level, issues that Stephen talked about, at the local level too. And this is where our elected officials are so important. I'm so excited that elected officials are here. But the questions have to be asked when they say things like, we can achieve 95% capture. You have to ask questions like, where has that been achieved? And is that a spike? Is that something that was achieved on average over a year? Was it achieved over 5 years? We can tell you that the Quest plant, which was on David's slide, started out at one level of capture, and every year the level of capture went down. What about downtime? You have to ask about that. You have that was something that David's investigation of the Petronova plant revealed, that it had a lot of downtime. So whatever it was saying in terms of we're achieving this in carbon capture, no, they weren't, because every time the CCS was down, the carbon emissions were still going out of the air. You have to ask, what are all the sources of carbon on the site? The natural gas comes into the plant. Some of it goes to the hydrogen production, but some of it goes to power the hydrogen production equipment. The carbon capture is put on the hydrogen process. It's not put on the power. When the carbon comes out, where does it go? It has to be compressed. It has to be pushed through a pipeline. What happens to the emissions for the power to do that? All the way through, you have to just get very specific because they're not telling you these things. And in fact, they're telling you things that are, I think, intentionally misleading. They are not saying what's really coming out of these plants.
Rachel?
Thanks, Joanne. I do want to echo Stephen in many ways. I think going back to this kind of transparency around the hubs piece, I think there are two really big challenges here. One is the congressional timeline is really, really short. Not to give a, get out of jail card for DOE, but they are dealing with some really fast timelines. That has made it really hard for them to engage. Two, this is a new thing for them. And I was talking actually to someone there this week, and they just don't know how to do it well. Historically, DOE hasn't been kind of at such a front or vanguard kind of area and space that requires so much engagement. So they're doing this kind of a learning by doing process. So all this to say that I fully agree with Stephen. I think keeping the public pressure on them is critical at this point, but also want to encourage folks to engage to the extent that they can on the hubs process, because the way the hubs is going to be structured will likely include a phase one where various proposals have to demonstrate, a suite of things. And we really want that phase to include strong engagement with local communities, with affected communities, as kind of a criterion by which DOE determines whether something is beneficial or not. So I think that's going to be an important step on the transparency and engagement with local communities. That's going to be absolutely critical. And would really strongly urge folks to the extent that they can to push DOE towards that as part of the phase one of the hub selection process.
Thank you. Sean, would you like to add something?
Yes, I would. And specifically, I'd like to build on the point that Rachel was just making, because in visiting and talking with folks around the region, one of the things that I hear that's disturbing, frankly, is that many people seem to have a sense that this is a done deal. The federal government has kicked in, they're allocating literally billions of dollars to do this, and that the kind of questioning and advocacy that Rachel just talked about, may not be of any use because people do perceive it's a done deal. And I want to assure everybody that that is far, far, far from the case. Even when we talk about the $8 billion that so far has been allocated to develop pilot projects and early deployment, that $8 billion is literally no more than about 2% of the money that would be required to do a full build out of the hydrogen hubs that we're talking about. In other words, it's not even a down payment on this. And the path that has to be traversed between here and getting to the point where sufficient dollars do become available or are found either in government or in the private sector to do this is a long way to go. And as evidence for that, I would cite a couple of episodes that our region has been through in the last decade. Many of us will recall that it was just a few years ago that we were hearing lots of advocacy for the creation of an Appalachian storage hub, which at the time was going to be for natural gas liquids. And there was significant movement at the federal level to fund research and other things into that effort. But of course, it never came to fruition. Then we heard the next great savior of the region was going to be what the Department of Energy called the Appalachian Petrochemical Manufacturing Renaissance, which anticipated that not just the Shell ethane cracker plant that's being built in Beaver County would be constructed, but that there would be 4 to 5 other ethane cracker plants in the region with an attendant array of support services and industries coming up around that. And there was significant expenditures there. I mean, for the shell cracker alone, the state of Pennsylvania extended $1.6 billion in support and subsidies for that plant. And yet, as we see now, fully 7 years after that plant began construction, there has not been another major petrochemical project begun in the entire region, and nor is there one even at this point on the drawing boards. And so I simply want to emphasize to people that although, yes, $8 billion currently being invested by the federal government in the development of hubs sounds like a big commitment, in the context of the amount of money that would be required to bring this concept to fruition, particularly in the Ohio Valley, it's a drop in the bucket. And that means that there is a great deal of room and opportunity for advocacy between now and then to persuade our policymakers of the error in this direction.
Thank you, Sean. So our next question is, given the realities that have been discussed here this evening and in all of your presentations, why are federal and state officials, industry groups, and civic leaders pushing so hard for this technology in our region? And for that, maybe I'll start with you, Suzanne, if you wouldn't mind beginning to address that question.
Well, the industry is certainly pushing for it because they know, they can see the writing on the wall. They know that electric vehicles are coming. They know that solar and wind is coming, and their market is going to shrink. So they're looking to build up a new market. So when you have a blue hydrogen facility, you can send the natural gas there not only as feedstock, but also to power the facility. And it's not what they'd really like. What they'd really like is to have things go on the way they were years ago. But given that they know certain parts of their market are going to shrink, they're looking to build up elsewhere. They've also been trying to push hard on petrochemicals for the same reason and running into market problems there. So that's where that impetus is coming from. That impetus is translated to the federal government, and then it gets translated back down to the states. I think that's really what drives all of this.
Thank you. Sean?
Yeah, I would just like to point out that if you take what's being proposed at face value in the claims, which is that in theory, what we're being told is that development of a blue hydrogen hub can simultaneously greatly reduce carbon emissions while also preserving jobs in natural gas and coal and in power plants throughout the region. That's obviously a very, very politically appealing message to be able to deliver. But it's a message that's being delivered usually without reference to the cost of doing so, and without reference or without the question being asked, are there better, more efficient ways of doing those things? And as evidence, I mean, I would point out that at least as I look at the news coverage that the proposed carbon and CCS hub has received, which has been considerable, I personally have yet to see a single instance in which a reporter has asked and any of the champions of the proposal have answered the simple question, how much will this cost? And that to me is very, very telling. And frankly, what I fear is that many of the people who are most fervently advocating for this probably don't know, and moreover, probably don't care. Because I think in many cases, I mean, we're a region that has struggled economically for a long time. And when you go down to the Mon Valley, when you go into the Ohio Valley or the Mahoning Valley of Ohio, we're talking about places that have seen job stagnation or job loss and overall population loss, going back to the 1970s when I was here in college. And you know, when anybody shows up with, I think, Suzanne, you may have used the words, you know, a new shiny object, or Shanti, you may have. Yeah, sure. There is. I have complete compassion for people wanting to gravitate to it, because there seems to have been a long period in which there haven't been any answers. And so I do understand the political appeal of the case that is being made for a blue hydrogen and CCS hub. But again, it's not only incumbent upon us to ask, what will it cost? And in conjunction with that, are there alternatives that would be less expensive and more effective, both at emissions reduction and also at job creation and economic development? Because if we don't ask those questions, if we react the way that we've reacted to the natural gas boom and then the suggested petrochemical boom, we will close our minds to those alternatives. Our policymakers won't be interested in hearing them. And that will leave us for the next decade in the same place that we've been in the last decade, which is where we see great industrial disruption in our region, but without any corresponding increase in jobs and prosperity. And we don't want to do that again.
Thank you, Sean. Rachel?
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to offer maybe not a different perspective. I fully agree with both Sean and Suzanne, but just want to introduce an extra note, which is, yes, there's a lot of myth here, absolutely. And industry, I fully agree, has been driving most of the narrative to date. However, I think what we discussed today is that this is a resource that could play a role, right? This is not a fully sort of greenwash tool that has absolutely no role in decarbonizing our economy. So how do we not throw the baby with the bathwater, I think is a really important point to keep in mind, and strongly urge communities and folks who are interested, as these policies start coming to Pennsylvania, to other locales, to really first request and kind of before the blanket opposition is request a transparent, rigorous analysis that demonstrates that this is a good idea. And by this, I mean hydrogen. Maybe blue, I fully agree, will never really have value, but let's assume even green hydrogen requires, rigor, because as we discussed, it can be very inefficient, very costly. There may be better alternatives. So before the kind of blanket opposition, I would strongly recommend that we push for transparent and public-facing analyses that first evaluate the potential role for hydrogen, and then go from there. Because again, we don't want to throw the baby with the bathwater, and I fear that because what Sean was saying, there's so much appeal here that blanket opposition may end up undermining our efforts, but more so than helping. So I think the attitude of informed skeptics, it could go a long way here as those policies start coming our way.
Thank you. For the next question, Shanti, would you like to respond to this question?
I think it's a really important point that Sean brought up about this idea about jobs, using the jobs pitch to sell the next potential strategy. I think we have work in our region that's going on right now, looking at the different kinds of investments that can actually generate jobs. There's even work being done right now on how community solar in Pennsylvania, if we pass the legislation, how many jobs we can create with that. We have also legislation right now on using the RGGI funds for weatherization, and that can also generate jobs and equitable jobs. So we do have all these actual job creation that's going on, but we need to amplify many of the successes that's going on in our region to tell the public that, look, these alternatives have been pursued and they are successful. Thanks.
Thank you. Our next question is a bit more technical on the question of carbon capture and sequestration technologies. So far this evening, many of the technologies that we've discussed appear to be motivated to enable fossil fuel plants to persist. But given the failure to reduce greenhouse gas emissions we will need some kind of carbon capture technology more powerful than trees to pull carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Is there federal support for that kind of carbon capture? And what is the relation between the carbon capture and sequestration discussed tonight in the hydrogen context and other technology like direct air capture just to reduce the emissions that are currently in the atmosphere? And Stephen, I thought we could start with you to respond to this question.
I'm happy to start, but I see David's got his hand up and Sean went off mute. So maybe if y'all are chomping at the bit, but I'm happy to. Okay, yeah. So I think there's a lot in that question. And I don't want to take 20 minutes disaggregating all the issues around direct air capture. But just for those who don't know, right, there's carbon capture, which typically refers to point source capture. So like you've got a smokestack and you try to capture that carbon dioxide and do something with it. Then there's direct air capture, which tries to pull the CO2 molecules directly out of the air. There are three main problems with direct air capture. One is just that once you have the CO2, it's the same as if you used carbon capture. So the kind of infrastructure and a lot of the fundamental policy instruments are the same, including like 45Q applies to both. This is the title in the tax code that provides a credit for carbon capture and sequestration. The other is just the energy. I mean, you're really fighting against the laws of thermodynamics with direct air capture. It's really, I mean, we're talking like 400 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere. So the energy required for direct air capture is so significant that if you scale it up, you end up putting pressure on the energy grid in a really fundamental way that ends up challenging the imperative to decarbonize the energy grid. We can go deeper into that, and there are some good studies about the energy use. On a practical level, the largest direct air capture project in existence right now is a joint venture with Occidental Petroleum. And the purpose of that direct air capture project is to create CO2 for use in enhanced oil recovery. I forget exactly what it is. There's like 7 direct air capture companies, and oil companies are on the board or invested in at least 3 of them. So as a functional matter, direct air capture is part of this carbon management paradigm in the same way that CCS is. In terms of federal support, which I think was actually the question you asked, there is money in addition to hydrogen hubs. There's funding for direct air capture hubs in the IIJA as well. And the 45Q tax credit, as I mentioned, would also apply to direct air capture. It's just so expensive that it's not really happening at scale.
Thanks, Stephen. Go ahead, David.
I agree with everything Steve said. The only thing I would add is it's not going to be proven for decades whether it works and if it's economic. And the first thing we have to do is stop emitting as much CO2. So there's less we need to pull out of the atmosphere. I hope someday down the line it does work. But for now, I do agriculture, planting trees. There's a range of possibilities that can be used to, I don't know whether you'd call it natural direct air capture. Do those because we know they work and we know they're fairly inexpensive while you're studying the direct air capture technologies that Stephen addressed. But stop emitting so much CO2. That's it.
Great. So we've heard throughout the presentations reference to the 45Q tax credit. And Stephen, you just talked about it a little bit, but I'm wondering if someone could address for the audience who may not be familiar with what that is or sort of how it's taking shape right now, just to address for everyone kind of the 101 level. What do we mean when we say the 45Q tax credit? Sean?
Oh, thanks, Joanne. Yeah, there is and has been for quite some time, going back almost a decade, a tax credit for companies that choose to employ carbon capture technology. And specifically, it enumerates, well, historically, it's provided about $35 per ton of CO2 that is captured. There are many bills pending in Congress right now, including in the Build Back Better legislation, that would greatly expand the value, increase the value of that subsidy. In fact, they would increase the value of the subsidy so much that it would be at a level that is greater than the presumed cost of implementing carbon capture. In other words, what we're talking about is a scenario in which theoretically the federal government would be providing a 100% subsidy to industry in order to do this. And beyond that, there is another provision that's present in many of these bills, because in order to claim a tax credit, you have to have sufficient tax liability. And many companies, especially in the fossil fuel industry, do not. Many of them at this point are money losing propositions. And so they have little, if any, tax liability. And so in addition to greatly expanding the value of the 45Q tax credit, many of the proposals also would switch it to a direct payment, which means that companies would be eligible to get money from the federal government, whether they had any tax liability or not. In other words, it would be an out-and-out grant based on the amount of carbon that you capture, and the amount that you would be paid in return for capturing carbon would, in many cases, be significantly greater than the cost of doing so, which is all a fancy way of saying that it would be completely underwritten by taxpayers.
So Joanne, just to add, that carbon capture, that 45Q covers both carbon capture that's used for storage and also carbon capture that's used for enhanced oil recovery. So there is no actual capture of carbon, and you can get a tax credit for that. And also in 2021, there was a reduction in the requirement of monitoring. So you just claim that you monitored and you reduced, you captured carbon, but there's actually not a rigorous requirement of verification.
Thank you. I did want to point out that there have been some additional resources shared from attendees in the session. So there are a couple of links to draw your attention to in the chat and the Q&A. I'd next like to ask a question that gets at kind of what states are doing in response to the competition for regional hub selection. So we've covered some about what the Department of Energy is doing, and I'm curious if we could address a little bit about how states are responding as this competitive program is shaping up. David? Oh, David, I think you're on mute.
Sorry. The states are running as fast as they can to get federal money. Wyoming is trying to get money for regional hub with similar to what we've talked about here, carbon capture from coal plants. New Mexico, surprisingly, because of its solar potential, is seeking to develop a blue hydrogen hub as well. I spoke to a reporter who was told by the DOE that there were 300 expressions of interest in submitting proposals, which surprised her because there are only 50 states. And the DOE couldn't explain how there were more than 50 proposals. So we'll see. I mean, I guess they have to file in May their proposals. And the DOE has to decide by a year from now. I think I might have that wrong, but I thought that someone told me that. So we'll see what they come up with. But as Sean said, we're really far from seeing anything in the ground. It's going to take years to plan. It's going to take years to design. Carbon capture is not like going to Home Depot and saying, I need a carbon capture facility for a steel plant or a coal power plant or a gas-fired power plant. You don't get something off the, the rack or off the shelf. It has to be designed, it has to be built, it has to be tested. So I think some will be tested, some technologies will be tested, will be funded. Congress has already appropriated the money, and we'll have to see how effective they are. But as Sean said, we're far from anything being a done deal. I mean, 20 years from now, they may laugh and say, my God, what an idea. It's a shame they spent money on that. Just like we look back at some of the expensive nuclear power plants that are being paid for.
The May 16th date is actually the date by which the Department of Energy has to put out the requests for the proposals. Right now, they're still in the process of figuring out how to ask people to submit and what they're going to be, requiring in terms of information and things. So this is going to be a slow process for sure.
So actually an important nuance here, DOE is actually only going to put out a draft proposal by May. So no one is expected to submit their proposals by May. It's just kind of a draft. And then DOE will solicit even more public feedback. And then we expect the actual solicitation to happen in late 2022. Unclear what that means, but we have a little bit more time. And then as David said, it's going to be a year after that before they actually make a selection. So we have, I would say, about a year and a half before we get a sense of the first hubs. And unfortunately, as David said, states are racing, right, to press their case to be selected as a hub. We're seeing, I would say, two categories of states here. Ones that are like signing memorandums of understanding, establishing public-private partnerships with other states and within their states to demonstrate to DOE that there's this big hub and we're collaborating with our neighbors and this is an opportune thing for you to invest here. Other states like New Mexico, Illinois, California to some extent are passing or proposing policies around hydrogen, either subsidies or other forms to kind of show DOE that, hey, if you invest here, it's not going to be a one-off investment. This is a sustainable ecosystem for hydrogen. We're investing in it anyway. Unfortunately, most of these policies have been quite trash because they're done really fast and they overlook a lot of the complexity and challenges with hydrogen. And I think this is what Pennsylvania is feeling right now, the pressure of doing something, seeing all kind of so many states do something to lay the groundwork, right, to be selected as a hub, which is why I think these sessions are so important. And it's important to keep track of whatever policies are proposed or arrangements are done, because so far the exemplars from other states have been unfortunately quite concerning.
Thank you. Representative Innamorato, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, actually, it was, it's in line with what Rachel was talking about. If we build, like I was thinking about the niche application of hydrogen to steel making, if we invest in building out that infrastructure that allows for that operation to occur, is it easy to change out the feedstock? So I'm thinking like Pennsylvania, right? We mostly rely on shale gas. If you build the infrastructure and you're using shale gas as the feedstock, how easy is it to switch to then using green sources to fuel that type of infrastructure, or will it have to be built specifically for the feedstock.
I welcome others' thoughts, and Sean, I see you want to come in, but I think from a steel plant standpoint, I don't think there's going to be any difference whether you're using green or blue hydrogen, for instance. The process is the same. A hydrogen molecule is a hydrogen molecule. However, I think the major difference here is if you know, the infrastructure involved with green versus blue hydrogen is so different that this idea of switching is not corroborated by the facts, right? And those are long-lived assets. In the case of blue hydrogen, for instance, an SMR with carbon pipelines, storage, so on, those are long-lived. You can't just switch, you know, easily. And similar for green, you know, transmission lines, electrolyzers, those are not going anywhere anytime soon. So yes, from a technological standpoint at the steel plant, you can switch, but there are the bigger implications that make a switch really tricky and costly.
Thank you. Sean, would you like to briefly touch on this, or?
Yeah, I was only going to say, if you're talking about switching, gas are more likely for blast furnaces, it's coal-fired to hydrogen. No, you would not be able to use the same infrastructure. You would have to build new ovens. So it would be a fundamental and major technological retro.
Thank you. So there are a couple of other questions in the chat. One, so Shanti and Sean, you've both talked a bit about opportunity cost and how what we do now and what we invest in now matters for long-term success for our region. So, you know, a comment in the thread is that the real threat is the important time and money that might be wasted on a solution that won't ultimately serve the region. Shanti, maybe I'll ask you to quickly address that, and then Sean, if you'd like to follow up.
Yeah, so if you look at the National Academy of Sciences study, they say that we can decarbonize at least 75% of our grid using existing technology, solar, wind, storage, demand response. So, and the IPCC report says basically we need to cut emissions very quickly to actually address to avert the worst impacts of climate. And the timeline that David has explained to us is just not feasible as a strategy in the short run. And I'm also very concerned about this idea that, you know, the federal government is offering money, and therefore states are running towards this dangling of money. But the real question is, what is the ultimate cost? If the federal government is giving you just X, and the states and local governments have to come up with 100X, then it's not a sensible, prudent economic decision. And what's even more concerning is about the picture that has been put out for us by Steve Fright, which shows us the pipelines. And given that we already have difficulty placing pipelines in the region, and we now have proposals of giving primacy to some of these pipelines, it is extremely concerning. And I did see actually a comment in the chat that we can actually use the current pipelines for hydrogen. No, we cannot. It's actually, there's a study by Congressional Research Services, that, or FAS, one of those two, that explain that the maximum you can use in these pipelines is 20% hydrogen and 80% methane within the pipeline. So if you want to use the pipeline for just hydrogen, it requires a new infrastructure. So all that investment, to what end? Very, very unprudent. I think the question that we need to ask is, what is the strategy that's cost effective for getting jobs, and what is the strategy that's cost effective for actual economic development? This might not be it. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, and what I'd like to add to what Shanti said, and with respect to the economic development opportunities and the threat that having local policymakers focus on the hydrogen hub, you know, will be a distraction. Again, this is a phenomenon that we've already seen going back to the beginning of the natural gas boom. And I'll offer as an example, I won't name it because it's frankly a little embarrassing at this point, but about a year and a half ago, I met with the county commissioners in a county that's part of an economic development district that had done an analysis of the assets available and the opportunities available in that region, which was a 4-county region, to develop new industry, new jobs, and a more thriving economy. And in their analysis, they had come up with only one item as a potential source of new jobs and economic development, and that was the construction of an ethane cracker plant, which, as we know, again, there's only been one constructed in the region. There are none at this point in the offing. And yet that organization, which was an economic development organization, was quite satisfied with what they had done, with the work that they were doing, because they genuinely believed that there was going to be a cracker show up in their neighborhood and that it would solve all of their economic development problems. It's a phenomenon, again, that we have seen before. And so, yeah, it concerns me immensely, because I don't think we are ever going to see the construction of a fully realized hydrogen hub in the greater Ohio Valley. What I fear is that even if that hub does not get built, it will take us 6 or 7 years before we reach that conclusion. And in the meantime, we will squander an immense amount of opportunity and resources that desperately need to be much more effectively used.
Thank you. So I know that there is a lot to discuss and that we're just kind of beginning this conversation. So I do want to be respectful of everyone's time. And I know we're coming up on the 8:30 timeline here, but there's one other issue that came up in the chat that if we could end on trying to answer this question, which is, what do the communities and those who live on the fence lines of these potential facilities need to be most focused on right now? And as we move through this process with the Department of Energy applications, state level efforts to introduce legislation or regulations to run alongside that. If you want to just raise your hand or unmute yourself and begin, this can just be open to all panelists. Stephen?
Yeah, very quickly, I think we need to talk about the actual impact of the carbon capture equipment itself. Carbon capture is talked about like it's a pollution abatement technique, but it's actually highly polluting. I don't know if I can share my screen, or if I don't know, I don't have that power. So I'm just going to read. I'm going to read from an excerpt from a Chevron Phillips chemical company application where they are talking about why they're not going to pay to put in carbon capture. For the cracker project, this energy penalty would result in generation of not only 30% more greenhouse gases, but would also increase emissions of NOx, carbon monoxide, volatile organic compounds, PM10, SO2, and ammonia by an equivalent percentage. Additionally, carbon capture and compression increases the water demand. Water consumption for the project could be increased by 80% or more. Fundamentally, carbon capture increases the pollutant load at the facilities on which it's parasitic. So from a basic environmental justice and public health and safety perspective, that has to be a dire concern, not to mention the impacts of the pipelines and the impacts of storage, which include, asphyxiation and induced seismicity and produced water. But I think those are crucial issues that the folks on the front lines or on the fence lines of these actual projects need to be really, really aware of, that this is not pollution abatement, this is pollution production.
Thank you. Rachel?
Yeah, thanks, Joanne. This is, I think, a critically important question, and I do not have a great answer, but really glad it was raised. One thing I'm hearing from various states where the hubs kind of are garnering a lot of interest is some stakeholders are saying, well, we're not really going to engage with local stakeholders because we don't hear them, but they want to engage, and they're going to be completely anti-hydrogen. So, why even go that route if they're going to oppose everything we say? So I would really hate to see that kind of become reality. And to the extent that you can, engage, put pressure, show that you are skeptical and want to see, transparent work whereby you are able to weigh in and be consulted. I think push for that process fairness is absolutely critical, and be vocal about it, because I'm seeing a lot of local groups in other states being overlooked as completely anti-hydrogen, hence we don't want to talk to them. It's not an easy feat, I know, but I think it's worthwhile.
Thank you. Suzanne?
Echoing a bit of what Rachel just said, being very vocal, but demanding a public process, engaging your elected officials. We've got elected officials on the call today, and that's exciting, to demand a very, very public process to decide what to do. The planning process should be very public, and all of the questions, the hard questions that we talked about, there should be answers for those questions. So really pushing for that kind of disclosure is extremely important. When people know the real facts, they're going to be asking the hard questions. Should we be doing this?
Thank you. Councilmember Strasburger?
Well, I just wanted to, I know this has been a listening session for me, but I wanted to offer my 2 cents on this question as well, because to build off of what everyone else has said in their answers, the finer point here in the Southwestern Pennsylvania region is that, while we have a representative Innamorato and me here on this panel, we both represent Pittsburgh and the Pittsburgh adjacent suburbs right outside. Or I don't, the representative does, but where the decision-making power often lies is with county commissioners, borough, township commissioners in rural areas that aren't the city centers and aren't necessarily primed to listen to us or to city dwellers, right? And so I think that the tremendous amount of work that many of the organizers who I think are listening in on this call have done, and the groundwork that's been laid to build trust and to build connections with all types of people from different communities all over the region is tremendously important right now, because of that reason. It's not going to necessarily, the answer won't necessarily come from the folks who are represented on this call. It's going to come from the people who are making decisions at, oftentimes at the borough or township level, like I said, in a different area. So just wanted to add that on.
Thank you so much. David, would you like to make some comments?
Yeah, I don't know if you can see me. I somehow got rid of I can't see myself, even though the camera is on. I wanted to, I agree with everything everybody said, and I don't mean to minimize the work ahead of us, especially you all who are younger than I am, over the coming decades. But there is a major transition going on already in this country. The amount of renewables that's been installed and that's in the interconnection queues around the country wanting to be installed to the electric grid is absolutely astounding. Last year, I wrote a report about it, actually earlier this year, how at the end of 2020, there was a tsunami of renewables and battery storage wanting to get on the grid. Well, the numbers have been updated, and now there's basically a tsunami and a third waiting to get on the grid. So while we have to keep working on the issues we've talked about, the markets support us. It's not like blue hydrogen or coal or natural gas-fired power plants are economic anymore. They're not. As Stephen mentioned, they're trying to fix their role so they can stay around for a while because the economics are against them. And so I think that while we have a lot of work, we also should be happy about how far we've come. That's all. I want to balance our discussion with a bit of a smiley face optimism, which I'm not usually known for.
Well, thank you very much. And thanks to everyone for joining this evening and for staying on a little over. I'm sure this is a conversation that is just the beginning of many. This is going to be an issue, and honestly, one of many issues in the energy sector that we're going to be continuing to wrestle with over the coming months and years. We have captured all of the questions and comments that were input into either the Q&A and the chat. So if we did not have a chance to get to your question, we can follow up with you and provide some additional responses. And please feel free to reach out to us. We're always happy to stay engaged and very grateful for your participation. I do want to open the floor to Representative Innamorato or Councilmember Strasburger in case you'd like to make any final comments.
I learned so much this evening, and I hope everyone else did on this webinar. I think to Susan's point that this conversation, it needs to happen in the public square, and there needs to be full transparency from elected officials on honestly what the conversations that are having and the resources that are proposed to be allocated and the communities that are going to be impacted and what kind of jobs are going to be created and who are they going to go to. There's many questions that the communities have, and we just need to make sure that they happen not to the public, but with the public. And I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation. And if anyone has any feedback or has additional questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to our office. Where most people know where to find us, and we're happy to connect with anyone on this panel to continue the conversation. So thanks.
And I'll just say, this was a big wake-up call for me. I know it's been publicized widely, but I think that if anyone who I represent is like me, I haven't read widely about this topic. And so I'm glad that this happened and that there are plans to continue to host these informational sessions, because I learned a whole lot. I have even more questions than when I started. And it's really important to be educating as many people as possible and be as far reaching and intentional about that. And I really appreciate David's final optimistic tone, because that's what I hang on to. That's what I cling on to when things get tough here in this, thinking about these challenging issues in the future is how far we've come and the bright lights in the future, the glimmers of hope in the future. So thank you all.
Thank you, and have a great evening. Our recording will be available if you'd like to revisit any of this. And yeah, again, just really appreciate everyone's time.